Greetings and welcome to the fifth class in the fourth semester of the Emerald Choral Academy. I am Gary Cannon, the artistic director of the Emerald Ensemble, a professional choir based in Seattle. This Emerald Choral Academy is a series of interactive webinars during which our area's leading professional choristers reveal their personal tricks of the trade to community singers around the world. These webinars are made available freely to all singers via YouTube. The Emerald Ensemble acknowledges that we operate on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish tribe, people past and present, and we aim to honor with gratitude the life itself and the life of those peoples. This presentation is funded in part by a grant from Washington State Arts Commission, in addition to the National Endowment for the Arts, For Culture, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and many generous donors. We encourage anyone participating or viewing this webinar to make a donation as you are able at emeraldensemble.org. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our mailing list to hear about future sessions of the Academy and the other activities of the Emerald Ensemble. This webinar is being recorded. By participating live, you are granting the Emerald Ensemble permission to share your contribution. Your microphones and cameras will remain off for the duration of this presentation. You can, however, ask questions to the presenter by typing into the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. And then periodically, I will interject to field your questions. I'm here with two remarkable persons this morning, at least it's morning here. Say at least they're remarkable here? No, they're always remarkable. One of those is Scott Kovacs, the executive director of the Emerald Ensemble. He keeps this whole endeavor of the Academy moving. And in fact, it was his idea in the first place. Yay, Scott. Today's presenter is Micahel Bennett. He now lives outside Boston, teaching at Concord Academy, singing with Boston Baroque, and generally taking Boston by storm. But being a Tacoma native, for many years, Micahel was active here in Seattle. Currently, he is a PhD candidate in music history at the University of Washington. Micahel is also a linguist, so he is aptly poised for today's topic, the International Phonetic Alphabet 102, Consonants. Thank you, Micahel Bennett.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be back and to expand upon the first workshop that we did on this topic, which was a sort of a broad overview of the International Phonetic Alphabet. So today we'll be digging in a little bit more deeply. So I will share my screen here. And all right, so yes, this is IPA 102, focusing on consonants. I've given you a little bit of a teaser here with putting some transcriptions of the title slide, including my name, and all will be revealed, the intricacies of that transcription as we go along. So just to give a little sense of an overview of everything that we will talk about, we'll first define a consonant, which sounds sort of mundane, but is actually necessary to fully grasp everything that we're talking about today. We'll do a little overview of vocal tract anatomy, a topic that I know has been focused on in some of the workshops in this series as well, but is related to how we form consonants and other speech sounds. We'll look at the IPA chart, just kind of refreshing ourselves on what that is and the symbols that are contained therein. We'll talk about the sort of most important aspects of consonants, which are place of articulation and manner of articulation. We'll also talk about another subclass called approximants and affricates. These are two additional kinds of classifications of consonants. We'll go deep into some very specific notation for narrow transcription called diacritics and suprasegmentals. And then we'll look at some common sounds that appear in foreign languages that we often find ourselves singing in as choral musicians. So we'll look at Italian, French, and German when we get there. Okay, so what is a consonant? This is we generally know that speech and therefore singing is made up of vowels and consonants. This is kind of these are the two ingredients of speech. So a consonant is a speech sound that is articulated with a complete or partial closure of the vocal tract. So if we think about vowels, vowels we sing generally unobstructed. The air is coming from the lungs and going through the mouth, and the vocal tract is basically open, and you're using articulators to shape the space inside your mouth to change the vowel, but it's generally unimpeded. Consonants are what interrupt that flow, and any conductor or singing teacher, consonants can sometimes be the bane of our existence as singers because we're wanting to sing. You can't generally sing on consonants. There are a few that you can, but in general that's interrupting that flow. So you've probably been told to sing on the vowels before. But consonants are necessary for speech and for language, so we can get our text across. So they are quite important. So in terms of obstructing the vocal tract or partially closing the vocal tract, as you can see, this is a sort of cross section of what the vocal tract includes. So, starting all the way down at where phonation is created using the vocal folds in the larynx, you'll see you have the two passageways, the esophagus and the trachea. Esophagus goes down into the stomach, trachea goes down into the lungs, and we have this feature of our anatomy called the epiglottis that when we swallow actually flips down and covers that entrance into the trachea, because we don't want any food or drink going into the lungs, obviously. And so there are some really interesting evolutionary theories about why this seems like a very precarious arrangement to have the trachea and the esophagus so close to one another, with the being this potential for choking, which happens to us as humans. But there's theories about the evolutionary advantage of the impacts that it has on our ability to speak and communicate using language, that sort of supersede this choking hazard. Moving further up, you have the tongue. That's this enormous muscle that fills the entire oral cavity. The uvula is the dangly part that sticks down across the at the end of the palate. So you have your hard palate that moves into the soft palate, and then the sort of tip of that is the uvula. That also there's another passageway up into the sinus nasal cavity. So there is this passageway from the sinuses down into the throat, the pharynx down here. Then proceeding up through the hard palate, there's a special place known as the alveolar ridge. We'll be talking about this quite a bit today. That's that hard spot just behind your front teeth is the alveolar ridge, and it's actually where a lot of speech sounds are articulated, particularly in English. And then, of course, in the very front of the vocal tract, you have the teeth and the lips. And anyone who's done the warm-up, the lips, the teeth, the tip of the tongue knows that these are the sort of most important, what we call articulators for producing speech sounds. So now we move to the International Phonetic Alphabet. Again, this is a system of writing, of transcription, that is meant to represent all possible speech sounds that we make in any language. So it is, as the name implies, an international system of transcription that you can look and see just how any particular word, separate from the orthography, in other words, the way that the written version of a word in a particular language, we can translate that to what exactly are the speech sounds, like how does that word sound in that language. And this is a kind of unequivocal, lots of languages, English and French are great examples, have letters that appear on the page that are not necessarily represented in how the word is pronounced. So IPA is an extremely useful tool, especially for those of us as singers who often find ourselves singing in languages that we don't ourselves speak or weren't, raised speaking and hearing. So this section of the chart, there was an attachment that went out with the email to you all that has the complete chart that includes vowels and a whole bunch of other symbols and diacritics that we'll talk about. This is the very topmost portion of the chart that is, as you can see here on the upper left, is representing the consonants. These are pulmonic consonants, meaning related to like pulmonary, as in your lungs. Air, these use air from the lungs to create these sounds. There actually are non-pulmonic consonants like clicks and other sounds that don't often appear in as many languages, particularly Western languages. So but this is the section of the chart that we'll be talking about today. And it can be a little overwhelming to look at. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of symbols. But I like to think of this as sort of the periodic table of speech sounds, particularly consonants. So just to give you a sense, you see a lot of symbols here, and I've sort of reduced it down just to show you that these are the symbols that are used in the English language. So we use less than half of the consonant symbols on the chart in English. English actually has, as far as languages go, it uses a pretty wide inventory of sounds and vowels. But as you can see, it still is less than half of the total possibility of sounds that exist in various languages. You can see that we do have sounds that occur in kind of every column, just about, except for a couple, and every row. And we'll talk about what all of these columns and rows are going forward. But this just gives you a sense of kind of where and what kinds of sounds are familiar to us as English speakers. Okay, so when we are talking about consonants, there are three key factors that need to be addressed when you are describing a consonant sound. The first is voice. So whether or not a consonant is voiced or not, that is whether the vocal folds are engaged while you're creating that sound. Then place, the place of articulation. So where in the vocal tract is the contact being made for this sound? And then the manner of articulation is how is the sound made? So the various sort of the sort of mechanics of what the way that the sound is being made, which we'll see in just a little bit. So just to give you an example, every consonant is described using those three descriptors, and that is that will sort of isolate. There's only one kind of consonant that has this particular combination of these three factors. So the symbol B, which is as what we know of as B, that is a voiced bilabial plosive. S is a voiceless alveolar fricative. Again, voice, place, and manner. And then this symbol, the third symbol, is what we would write in English as NG. And that is a voiced velar nasal. Okay, we will go into what all of that means in just a moment. Before we go on from that, maybe this is actually a good point to just pause and see if there are any questions so far.
I do not see any questions yet, though now I really want to Google about the evolutionary advantage of an epiglottis, Because you're right, that flap seems really stupid. I mean, what would the alternative be? Two different intake systems, one for air. Oh, I realize I'm off video now. One for air and one for food. Wow.
Yeah, so I am not an expert on animal anatomy,
I don't
but
mean to imply you should be, or that you
I
would be.
do know that in other animals and mammals in particular with lungs, that placement of the opening to the trachea and the esophagus are not so close to one another. Um, yeah,
Cool. All right.
yeah,
Sorry. Thank you for indulging me in that.
okay.
Let us proceed with our voice to velar nasals. Very good.
Okay, good. So let's see. So just voice is the easiest thing on the chart to understand. So basically, you'll see at the bottom of the chart that I've distributed to you all, there's this sentence that says symbols to the right in a cell are voiced, to the left are voiceless. So if we look at a pair, so what we call a minimal pair, that is, they have only one thing different about them. So P and B, those two sounds, they're both bilabial plosives. The only difference between them is that P is voiceless and B is voiced. And so it's the same sound. It's made by bringing your lips together and then expelling air through them, basically. And so, but in one case, your vocal folds are engaged, and the other they're not. So this is true across the entire chart. So the difference between a T and a D, same thing. It's the same sound. It's just are your vocal folds engaged at the moment of articulation. Another pair that we could compare would be S and Z. So S versus Z, one is voiced, one is voiceless. Okay, so that's a pretty simple thing to look at when you're looking at the chart. Just remember voiceless to the left and voiced to the right. You'll see that some symbols, like nasals, because of the way that they're produced, it's actually not possible. Well, it is possible, but we represent it through a diacritic. So there's not a separate symbol for a voiceless nasal. It's very difficult to hear a voiceless nasal sound. So if you could think about saying, closing your lips like an M and then just breathing out of your nose, that would be a voiceless M, but you wouldn't really hear that. It would just sound like, breath coming through the nose. So great. Okay, now moving on. So to the place of articulation. So remember, when we're describing speech sounds, it's voice, place, and manner. So the place of articulation runs along the top of the chart, and it roughly corresponds sort of to that cross-section of the vocal tract anatomy that I showed you before. So on the left-hand side are the lips. So if you imagine looking at a head that's looking, to the left, the lips are on the left, and then you go across the palate and down the vocal tract toward the glottis. So I'll show you what that looks like. And I apologize, the text on here is a little blurry, but you can still read it. So bilabial sounds, those are the two lips appear, on the left of the chart. So there's bilabials on the extreme left, because that's where the lips are. And then you proceed through dental sounds, labiodental. Labiodental means involving the lips and the teeth. Alveolar is that alveolar ridge I talked about, and then post-alveolar, this is considered a separate location, so just slightly further back from the alveolar ridge. You can, you might think, okay, this is a little bit in the weeds, and you can see how actually the alveolar and dental and post-alveolar, those are all kind of in one column on the chart, because, really alveolar is kind of one space, but there really is a slight distinction between, for instance, where your tongue would be if you said, for instance, TH, that's in some cases that's actually interdental, right? So where your tongue actually goes between your teeth, and then alveolar is where you would form an S or a Z sound. And then if you think about these two symbols are sh and zh, and there is a slightly further back placement of the tongue between an S and a sh. So there is a slight moving, that's why that post-alveolar actually exists as in terms of a separate space. Not represented on this diagram here is the retroflex. These are not sounds that these occur in Middle Eastern languages a lot. It really has to do with the positioning of your tongue more than the location. So it's a curved back tongue in the mouth. Palatal, again, that's your hard palate. Velar is your soft palate. Uvular makes sense, is the uvula. And then we have some pharyngeal sounds, and then epiglottal and glottal sounds. So the pharynx is that space in the back, very back of the throat, beyond the uvula, but not all the way down at the glottis. Okay, so just to kind of think about some examples of each of these places, we'll go back to this chart of English speech sounds. So bilabial sounds, you can think of using both lips. So, P, B, and M, these are sounds that make sense. Those are the using the two lips. Moving on, labiodental, using the lips and the teeth. So F and V, you're putting your top teeth on your lower lip. So that's where the contact is being made. I already talked about the TH sounds, right? Dental, sometimes described as interdental. There are some subtle differences in various languages and even just speakers of English about how far your tongue protrudes between your teeth to make a TH sound. That can vary speaker to speaker, but it's definitely using the two teeth. There are the alveolar sounds, as I said, there's a lot of sounds that are articulated on the alveolar ridge. So that includes T and D, N, S, Z, Z, and L, right? These are all places where your tongue is touching that ridge behind your front teeth. We talked about sh a little bit. That's that post-alveolar place. We do not really have a lot of palatal sounds in our language. We will talk about some in other languages that are pretty common. The one that we do have is an approximant, and we'll talk about that too a little bit later, but it's J, it's the Y, like where you make a Y sound. So your tongue approaches that part of your, the roof of your mouth. It doesn't really touch it per se, which is why it's an approximant, but that is the place where that Y sound is created. And then velar sounds for us, a K and a G or an NG. It's that tongue in the back of the back of your tongue, kind of creeping up to touch the soft palate. Finally, we do have some glottal sounds of voiceless H. So just expelling air through the vocal folds, but with a little bit of friction. And then a glottal stop, like uh-oh. This is something we talk about as singers quite a bit, the glottal stop. Sometimes we want a little bit of a glottal, although lots of times we are trying to avoid it. Okay, so that is place of articulation. Any questions about place of articulation and how it corresponds to the vocal tract anatomy?
Nothing yet.
Okay. So then moving on to manner of articulation. So the various manners of articulation, they run along the left side of the chart. And these are not arranged in any kind of anatomical order, but they each have a very specific meaning. So I've defined them here on the next slide. So the first kind of sound is a plosive, also called a stop consonant. That is a complete obstruction of airflow in the vocal tract. So when you think about a P or a B, you form a total closure with wherever that place of articulation is. You totally stop the air and then let the air go again. So it's a stop of the air flow. The next manner of articulation is a nasal. So that is where you obstruct the oral cavity in some way. So air cannot escape through the mouth, but rather the air flows through the nose. So you saw on that diagram, the anatomical diagram, how there was that passageway from the throat basically up into the nasal cavity. So that is how air, but you can stop the air at different places in the mouth. So an M is stopping the air obviously right at the lips, but an NG is stopping the air at the soft palate. So there's various places where, and that actually that's a perceptible difference to someone listening to the sound. You can hear the difference depending on where you're stopping the air in your mouth. A trill. So this is a kind of articulation that we don't have in English, but we do sing often in foreign languages and during warm-ups. So for instance, a lip trill, that would be a voiced bilabial trill. We are often singing on lip trills and warm-ups. It actually exists as a speech sound in some languages, so that it's represented on the chart. There's both a voiced and a voiceless version of that lip trill. The other one that is most often sung and appears in languages is the rolled R. So, that we often use in many languages, and we'll see that the rolled R becomes an important modification in a difference between spoken languages and sung languages when it comes to R's. The tap or flap. This is where one articulator is thrown against another rapidly. So in English, we do use an alveolar tap in words like butter or better. So that is a very fast throwing of the tongue against the alveolar ridge. It's different than saying the letter D, which is a little bit more deliberate and takes a little bit more time. The tap and the flap is a very quick action. A fricative, which is a fun word, everybody's favorite IPA word. A fricative is related to the word friction, understandably, and is a continuous sound where friction is caused by articulators that are brought very close to one another, but not forming an entire closure. So that S that we talked about before is a fricative sound. It is the same place of articulation that you would make a T or a D. It's that alveolar space, but you're bringing the tip of your tongue quite close to that area and then blowing air through it. So you're causing that friction. You're not fully closing it, otherwise it would be a stop. It would be a plosive. And then finally, an approximant. So with approximant sounds, articulators come very close to one another, but they don't make contact. So we already talked about the Y sound, y. So the tongue is coming quite close to the roof of the mouth to make a Y, that J glide as it's often called, but they don't touch. And nevertheless, that's an audible sound. These approximants, we'll talk about, some of them do not actually appear in the consonant chart because they are in this kind of gray area, because as we defined consonant, consonants generally represent a closure of the vocal tract, and because approximants actually just don't fully close off the vocal tract, in some cases they're not actually considered consonants. They're in a separate class by themselves. Okay, so looking back at the chart, the IPA chart again, with our these are our English speech sounds. You can see that we have, as I said, just about every kind of sound, it's particularly every manner of articulation, with the exception of trills. And then this very specific, where there's only one example of this lateral fricative. So you'll see lateral fricative and lateral approximant. Lateral refers to the tongue, and these are places where, for lateral approximants, you do form a closure, but air is still able to escape. It's just that the air is escaping around the sides of the tongue, as opposed to down the center of the vocal tract or out through the mouth. So when you make an L sound, you're obstructing the front of your mouth, but the sound is still going around the sides. Okay. Similarly, for the velar L, which I transcribed as the last sound in my first name, Michael. It is in that same place as you would make a K or a G or an NG, but it is, you're not fully closing off the air there. You're just kind of bringing the back of your tongue, and air is still able to escape. So ol, so Michael, baseball. We have a lot of words in the English language that end in L, and when you really think about it, you're not saying the L like you would at the beginning of a word that starts with L. You're actually making that L sound in the back of your throat, particularly when it comes to the ends of words. Okay, so so now hopefully you're able to see the difference between these sounds, especially those that occur in the same category. So alveolar, again, the same place of articulation. We have our plosives T and D, total closure of the vocal tract. The nasal N in that same spot. The tap that I mentioned in butter, better. S and Z sound is the fricative in that place, that alveolar ridge. And then the approximant in that area is the American R sound. So again, our tongue is coming close to that alveolar ridge for, you know, words like red, but it's not making total contact. So that's why it's an approximant. And then, yes, the lateral approximant L as well. So that gives you a good, looking at the alveolar place, we have most of these sounds in our language. The ones that we don't are the trill, that rolled R, brr, you know, that's in that same place of articulation. And then a couple of lateral fricatives, which is where you would put your tongue in that place and then allow air to roughly flow around the outside of it. So some people who have a speech impediment in English, like it's a kind of lisp that certain people have, that's the sound that's created when they're making that sort of L sound that has a sort of fricative quality to it. Just to look at, again, these approximants and affricates, which are a couple of additional sounds before I ask for questions. So you'll see on the chart below the pulmonic consonant section, there is a section called Other Symbols, and right at the top are a couple of sounds that do not make it onto the chart because they are in this, as I said, gray area. So in some cases, there are sounds that are considered what are called semi-vowels. So they are sort of like consonants and sort of like vowels. So y is one of them because you're kind of making a vowel sound, but then there's movement. So that's why it's often called a J glide. So you start with like an E vowel, yeah, and then you transition to some other vowel. So that's, your tongue has to kind of glide in your mouth to make that sound. And then the same thing is true of W. The W is really just an oo vowel to start, that's followed by another vowel sound. So like ooey or way. or, so you're basically starting with a W or with an U vowel. So we have both voiced version of this, and then the voiceless, which is used in sort of careful English diction, like which and when. Okay, so that aspirated kind of W sound is that upside down W. We've already talked about the lateral approximants. So the last sort of classification of sounds that I want to talk about are affricates. These combine two consonant sounds into one sound, and they are written in IPA with the two symbols joined by this little bracket that looks kind of like the top of a fermata. So, we have two of these in English. The J sound in words that start with J, like judge, it's actually in there twice, the beginning and the end. And I chose a similar example for the T and followed by SH, so ch, so church. These two, it's at the beginning and the end of that sound. So it's really considered one sound, not separate. You're saying a T followed by an SH sound. Tush. It's you're doing them one at the same time, basically. Okay. Any questions about all of those, the voicing, place, and manner of articulation?
I absolutely now want to tell people I'm going to church. To church.
Yes. Yes.
Wow, that's challenging. Yeah. We do have a few questions.
Okay.
One is regarding the L in Michael and baseball. Is that partly a regional, are there regional distinctions for that? I try to speak at Michael and I feel my tongue definitely curling to the front, or, touching to the teeth. But maybe there's something else I'm just not aware of quite yet going on velarly or.
So I think it's hard. One of the tricky things about phonetics and phonology is being able to capture people not being careful. Because as soon as you say, like, well, does the front of your tongue touch your teeth when you say Michael? It's like, yes, if I was saying my name maybe just on its own, and that was the only, like, when I just did it just then, at the end, my tongue did touch my front teeth. But if it was mid-sentence, Michael went to the store, I don't think my tongue would make contact with my front teeth. I mean, I just did it and it didn't. So there's that, it's that back of the throat L that gets.
Oh, you're right. Michael. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's really contextual. So it depends on the sounds. Many speech sounds change depending on what the environment immediately around them, right? So it really depends on, especially things that are word final, then what comes in the next word. And we know this from singing and lots of things that, sounds change, particularly in French, like where there's an elision or not,
So. French and Czech and some of the others, yeah.
Yeah.
This leads well into next question, is that the difference, and maybe you're getting into this later. If so, just ignore the question now.
Okay.
Which is how these are applied when spoken versus sung, and the relationship between those two activities.
Yes.
I doubt we would close the Michael when we're trying to sing it. So the difference in transcription, or the difference in practice, or any of it above.
Yeah, so that's interesting, yeah, because there are places where, especially in singing, as I said, you really can basically, there are some sounds you can sing on consonant wise, and we often have, the closed lip singing, or, but in general, you're singing on vowels. So if we had an extended pitch on the second syllable of my name, you'd have to basically invent a vowel, a schwa, I guess, that you would sing on. So yes, and we know this from French as well, the final schwa that doesn't get really spoken, but we often are singing on the final schwa in words that end in E. So yes, there are definitely differences. And even, when it comes to consonants, we'll talk about that when I get to those languages.
Cool. One final question at this moment, which is wonderfully specific, regarding a voiceless, a kind of Welsh voiceless L sound.
Mm.
How that differentiates from the English L sound that we know and love. I'm not expecting you to know Welsh.
Yeah, so and I don't, but I'm imagining it's this lateral fricative, so where it's where you're putting and that you'll notice this comes in voiced and voiceless varieties. So I'm wondering if it's this L with this kind of curly bit on it, that is that kind of Welsh. It would be a sound where there's some friction going around the sides of the tongue.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
That is the correct symbol for that.
Cool.
All right. Cool. Let's proceed. Thank you very much.
Okay, so as we said, it's very easy to understand this and talk about it in abstraction, but it's nice when we put it with some things that are in context and familiar to us. So I've transcribed a couple of familiar texts that people will probably have sung in a choral environment, so that you can really see the way that the IPA is put into practice here. So so on the left, obviously, I have the IPA transcription and the sort of English translation, if you will, the sort of the way that the text is written. So I'll just sort of speak through these and think about and kind of dissect what's going on here. Now, keep in mind that we are focused on consonants for this workshop, and perhaps we'll do a deep dive on vowels. There's a lot to say about vowels, but for now, this is our focus is on the consonants. If ye love me, keep my commandments. Okay, this actually all looks pretty straightforward in terms of the way that our speech sounds, like the letters that we use in the alphabet for English words have a lot of correspondence to the IPA symbols, so it kind of makes sense. And I will pray the Father. Now, the Father, this symbol is the voiced TH. So for instance, not when I have the word nothing down here, that this theta symbol is the voiceless variety, and this symbol up here is the voiced version of a th. The Father. You can sense that the vocal folds are engaged there. You'll see that this schwa with this little hook on it is that vowel. Again, it's kind of a vowel related thing, but it represents a kind of rhoticity to the vowel. And he shall give you another comforter. Okay, so again, pretty straightforward. The other example I included here is my spirit sang all day. Oh, my joy, nothing my tongue could say, only my joy. So here you have two instances of this affricate of the D and J sound combined for joy. Lots of diphthongs in English in general. But this particular text is full of them, which we can talk about diphthongs when we do a session on vowels. But it does make singing in English tricky, as we all know. All right. Now, if you want to get even more specific, you can. There's always these subtle things that you're trying to represent that are even beyond just simple vowels and consonants. So this is what we often refer to as broad transcription versus narrow transcription. So you can do very, very specific, trying to represent every single detail of the speech sounds. So and we use diacritics and suprasegmentals. So I've blown up this section of the chart. This is also on the full chart that everybody got. So diacritics, these are little additional symbols that can get added to the IPA symbols that affect the way that something is pronounced. So I've highlighted the ones that you might come across or that are particularly common in languages that we might be commonly singing in, and that are probably the most useful for us, or that you might even see in a transcription of English. So for instance, the aspirated T and D, this is, or any consonant. The English language is a heavily aspirated, there's a lot of leaky air in English. So, and when we say T at the beginning of a word, there is this little bit of extra kind of air that escapes, like a kind of H, that doesn't exist in a lot of other like Romance languages. So when you're singing in Italian or Latin, we always say, oh, dentalize the T, don't aspirate your T's when you're saying beata, it's not beata, with that sort of leaky air, but in English that is how we would say that. So that's the symbol for aspiration, whereas there is actually a diacritic for dentalizing certain symbols. The other one that I would point to is this no audible release. So when there is like, for instance, a T at the end of a word, and you don't want that aspiration after it. This is a lot of I'm thinking in Italian and Spanish, lots of words end in vowels. But if you did have a word that ended in a consonant that you didn't want released, there's that little this little cap symbol. Other symbols that so when I transcribe my name again, Micahel, I use this lower diacritic that's used to say when a consonant actually functions as a syllable on its own. This gets into that really subtle question about, is there a vowel there? So in the second syllable of my name, Micahel, basically the L, the consonant, is functioning as the syllable by itself. So you don't necessarily need to transcribe a schwa in my name, Micahel. You could, I think that would just be a matter of taste or specificity. It's shown under an N here because there are lots of places, particularly in English, where we also have this. So a word like button, button, basically you have a T, an unreleased T, but and then there's no vowel there. It's just you're changing from a T to an N, and the N is functioning as the syllable on its own. Button. You could, if you said button, if you were being really careful, then yes, okay, there's a little bit of vowel there before you close to the N, but that's not really how it's probably pronounced in most casual speech. The other diacritics I have here are the rhoticity. I've already shown that on the R. So when a vowel takes on a sort of rhotic quality to it. And then particularly important when we look at French is the nasal. So when you have, this just means that the velum is down. So you're actually breathing out of your nose and your mouth at the same time. So you're allowing air to escape through the nasal cavity, which we don't typically do for vowel sounds, but in English, certainly. But in languages like French and Portuguese, it's very important. They're actually considered distinct vowel sounds. And the meaning of the word can change depending on whether it's nasalized or not. Okay. Suprasegmentals, these are, again, just helping to indicate stress, indicate length, and syllabification. So you maybe, if you're familiar with IPA for singers, you'll often see this little symbol after a vowel to show that it is a long vowel, okay, meaning it gets a kind of weight and duration to it. The primary and secondary stress, so this is, the word here is phonetician. which is a clever little thing by the developers of the IPA chart to use this as an example word, phonetician. So the primary stress is actually on t, phonetician, but there is a secondary stress at the beginning of the word, phonetician, right? So that's just showing that. And then the other thing that you might see is syllable break, if you're trying to be really specific about where the syllable is separated here. So in the word like react, okay, and then oftentimes linking two words together to show that there's no break. So this is again going back to French, an example of a language where things get joined together quite often. Okay, so I'm conscious of the time, so I'll just move on to some of these common sounds that we have in foreign languages. Is that okay, Gary?
I'd love to interject with two possibly
Yeah.
short questions.
Great.
Time is flexible.
Okay.
One is we have that section on roticity. What does that mean? I'm picturing a chicken on a spike.
Yes, not rotisserie,
Right.
roticity. So adding that kind of R coloring to a vowel. So in the case of the sort of rhotic schwa sound, that's the American So it's taking a schwa vowel and adding, changing the position of your tongue to kind of give it that quality.
So
But you could do this
specifically is about that then it's not that there's another action in the mouth. It's more a matter of the sound.
Yeah. So this is particularly important for words that end with this sound. So although I did it on the word comforter. So basically this American R is typically like an intervocalic sound or a word initial sound. So really, or very, it occurs in the middle of two vowels. So it's a kind of, that's why it's an approximate, because your tongue kind of makes that shape as an interrupting thing. When it functions like as a vowel itself, and it's not in between two vowels. So comforter, you're not really saying a vowel and the American R because it's really just functioning as a vowel. So father, it's not exactly correct to transcribe that as a schwa followed by an American R. It would be okay, but really that American R symbol, the upside down R, is you really need to think about it as a consonant sound as opposed to a quality of a vowel. So yeah, and so that this diacritic can be added to a vowel like ah too. So like ardor, if that was a word, like that English word ardor.
I really want to add a piratical R.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
My last question on this, and it's with this page too. We've identified things like what we write orthographically as an S, as voiceless by definition. And
Right.
this is on one of your highlighted sections, but I'm curious about how one does, or roughly what that is, a voiced S that's not a Z. And I tried to engage the voice a little bit. Is it a matter of degree?
Yes, it's the same. I would ask the same thing about what is a voiceless D, if not T. So I think where this would be used, and I'm a little bit out of my depth, so I mean, but what I imagine is that it is used to indicate deviance from standard practice. So if a word in a particular, so let's say you were trying to transcribe a particular speaker or a particular accent within a given language, and there's a sound that is normally would be in a word that would normally be transcribed with an S sound, or in this case, the other case, a D sound, but the speaker happens to be deviating from that. that seems to be a good way to show, because again, these symbols are all to, like, if you're trying to really accurately describe like a particular speaker, like out in the field that you recorded, and then you wanted to transcribe exactly what gives them that particular quality. So this is a terrible thing that I'm thinking of, but it sort of feels like if you were maybe had too much to drink and you were slurring a little bit, there might be some voice. There might be some voice creeping into your S sounds. Are you really saying a Z, like a Z sound? No, you're just sort of lazily maybe having a little bit of extra voice where you normally wouldn't.
I was imagining, because there's so many different types of vocal lisps that could go in any direction, that might play around with that too.
I think also, there's definitely like if you start with a voiceless S, but then in your transition to the vowel sound that follows it or something, you add a little bit of voice in there because you're starting to transition to the vowel. That would be a very, very specific kind of thing that you're trying to isolate, but.
Neat. Okay, thank you very much for allowing that interruption there.
Yeah. And then I should have highlighted this one, creaky voice. That's vocal fry. There's a diacritic for that. So.
I was thank you for pointing that out. That's all.
Yeah. Okay, so foreign languages. So I've done the three sort of big languages that we often find ourselves singing in: Italian, French, and German. It's funny because when you look at some languages, they can appear so different on the page in how they're written. But then when you look at the IPA collection of sounds, it's like, oh, we have all or most of those sounds in English. So it's not as daunting often once you look at just the IPA. It's just maybe a different combination than we're used to seeing in English. But there certainly are some unique sounds in Italian. So the voiced palatal lateral approximant. Okay, so think about this. So it's a voice, so palatal, it's in that y space. It's a lateral approximant, meaning that you are making contact with the tongue, but the sound is flowing around the sides of the tongue. So this gets into a little bit of things that we might or might not sing. So the word familia, you might just do as like an L with a J glide, familia. But in spoken Italian, it really is famiglia, which is that fricative, that sort of approximate, where the air is going around the sides of the tongue. Famiglia, famiglia. So there's a little bit of that, and whether or not, if you wanted to sort of do an authentic Italian pronunciation, I think you'd want to err on the side of that for even in singing. So that's a symbol that we're not used to seeing a lot. The voiced palatal nasal. So that's the ñ sound. So in a word like cigno. Here again, it is its own distinct symbol as opposed to an N followed by the J glide. Cigno. You could, you could transcribe it that way probably, but it has its own symbol, so you can just use it. Cigno. As I already mentioned, you have lots of examples in Italian of the rolled R. Terra, okay, would be an example. So that's the voiced alveolar trill. And then this is more just sort of something to note in Italian, which is that oftentimes in English, when we have a double consonant in a word, it doesn't really serve any function in terms of pronunciation. So a word like apple, you would just, you would transcribe that as with just one P sound in IPA. In Italian, the double consonants really matter and sometimes differentiate between two words. So when you're doing IPA transcription of Italian, you actually do transcribe, you'll see both consonants transcribed to show you that you really have to do this kind of complete closure. So for a word like tutti, there's really a longer stop. We know that these are called stop consonants now. So it's like a double stop, tutti. or della. You're really doing both. It's not just della, it's della. So there's that extra kind of stop in there. The other thing I love about Italian is that we get some exciting consonant clusters, particularly at the beginning of words, that we don't normally get. So like ZBR, sbracciato, or ZBL, sbloccato. So that's just a kind of a fun thing about singing in Italian. So here's some practice. So here's this Archidelt madrigal that most people probably know, and I've transcribed it into IPA. So il bianque. Now here's a something. So this is where we start to get kind of specific here. Even though if you were to say this by itself, il bianco è dolce Cigno, you could say each word by itself, but actually in practice, the O and the E get elided. So it sounds more like, and especially how it's set to music, il bianco è dolce Cigno. So I've transcribed it as KWE, que, il bianco è dolce Cigno, that affricate that we have in English, cantando more. This is fun to see places where there's like almost no difference between the orthography and the IPA transcription, especially in Italian. This happens a lot. Latin as well. Ed io. Now here I kind of hemmed and hawed about whether I would do io or io, like with a J glide. Conductors and people can debate about that. Oftentimes, as we know from singing Italian, composers will set it on 1 or 2 notes, and then that sort of clarifies what you're supposed to do. But ed io, I just did it as a J here, as I think it's more accurate. Ed io piangendo. So there's that J glide again. Piangendo. Giungual. So here's another elision of the O to the A, which creates a W sound. Oa. Or giungual, and so again, and this is always the forward L in Italian. Giungual fin del viver mio. Here again, is there a J glide between the I and the O? Io, mio, maybe, but you kind of accomplish the same thing just by saying the 2 vowels in succession. And the way it's set in the madrigal is on 2 separate notes, so it's pretty clean. Viver mio. Okay, that's my Italian. Were there any questions about the Italian?
You're good. Keep going.
Okay.
Ooh, French. Yay.
Yes. French, lots of fun sounds. Now, French is one where, a lot of these come with caveats because they are often sounds, or some of them are sounds that might get simplified or altered in sung French versus spoken French. So, and I've mentioned this here. So, but I included a sound that we actually do have in English. It's not very common, and it's basically only used in words that are imported from French, like rouge, but it's the zh sound. So it's the kind of voiced SH, but it of course appears all the time in French, including the word for I or me, je. Now, this next one is a labiopalatal approximant. So this symbol actually does not appear on the IPA consonants chart. It appears down below in the other symbols section as an approximant. So this is the labiopalatal approximant. So when you're thinking about that definition, labio, lips, and palatal, that y space at the same time. So you're closing your lips sort of like an oo or a W, and you're bringing your tongue up to that roof of your mouth. So in a word like lui in French. So it's this very specific sound to this language, lui. And we'll see an example of it in the piece that I chose. Then there is that same kind of upside down Y symbol that I included for Italian. It appears in French. So in a word like papillon, the word for butterfly, papillon. It's that, again, palatal lateral approximant. So the tongue is coming close to the, we're making contact with the palate, the soft palate. Papillon. Okay. Now the voiced uvular fricative, which I'm not particularly good at making. I can do it better inhaling actually than I can. And if you sort of tilt your head back, it's just not a sound that I'm, it just takes practice. But this is the way that R is typically articulated in spoken French. But for those who have experience singing in French, usually you are going to be substituting the rolled R in the front of your mouth in place, or a tap in place of that. So the homophone mère, meaning mother or sea, like ocean, in French would be spoken as mère, with that sort of back of your throat R, but in practice, when you're singing it, mère, with the rolled R in the front of your mouth. And then French does have some instances of that palatal nasal as well. Nye, agneau, okay, the word for lamb, also appears in French. So, so here's my French example, and again, I have, so if you were to speak this French text, you would, the R's, like mon cœur se recommande à vous, would be that back of your throat uvular R, whereas when we sing it, we are typically just turning those into flipped or rolled R's. Okay, mon cœur se recommande à vous, tout plein d'ennui. So here's that that symbol, that's sort of lateral approximant. D'ennui. It's not just a W, although there may be. This is, I think, again, an IPA source, which we'll talk about later, does include it as a symbol for transcription for even for sung French. And so, but I think there might be some who say, it's not as pretty, and just do it as a W. D'ennui. I don't know. Et de martyre. Again, that would be in the back if you were speaking it. Martyre, but martyre probably when you're singing it. Au moins en dépit des jaloux, faites qu'à Dieu vous puisse dire. So there's that same symbol again. Puisse. So it's when you see that, you might think, oh, it's like puisse, but to be kind of authentically French, there is that little bit of the combination of the lip closure at the front and the palatal tongue position. You'll see all of these tildes over the vowels. Those are, of course, as we mentioned with the diacritics, represent nasal vowels. Almost any time a vowel is followed by an N. And but you will see in a word like d'ennui, the N is transcribed because it's a double N in the spelling of the, so you get the nasal vowel and the N sound. Okay, and finally German. There are lots of sounds in German that are unique from English, although some are more difficult than others to kind of wrap your head around. So there's a couple of affricates that I'm starting with here. The TS affricate, which we don't really have in English per se, although you could make a case that words that end in TS kind of have that, but particularly in a word initial position. So a word like Zeit. this voiceless alveolar affricate Zeit. German also delightfully has this PF consonant cluster that starts certain words or it is in the middle. So like Pfeffer, which is the word for pepper, and Apfel. Again, you're not really saying Apfel when you say the word apple in German. It's like one sound. This is not technically an affricate per se, because affricates generally need to be made in the same place of articulation. So you'll notice like P and F, it's that labial and labiodental, or TS is made in the alveolar position. But I've included this consonant cluster because it's unique and certainly not something that we have in English, but it's the KV consonant cluster. So for words that in German are spelled as QU words. So quellen, quellen, the K followed by the V can be a difficult consonant cluster. All right, now everyone's favorite sounds when we talk about German are the Ich laut and the Ach laut. Okay, so this is the that fricative sound, neither of which we have in English, and that are actually different, but that are represented in German with the same two letters, that CH. So there's actually two different places in the mouth, two places of articulation where this occurs. So the one is palatal and the other one is velar. So, and it roughly corresponds to the front or backness of the vowel. Again, something to dig into with vowels, but vowels are front, mid, back in terms of their placement in the mouth, kind of where the tongue is. So front vowels correspond with the sort of more front version of this sound. So that is the voiceless palatal fricative in words like ich and nicht. So you're making it in that same spot that you make the Y sound. Y, ich, it's that fricative there. Whereas if you have a back vowel like ah followed by a ch written in German, you'll get the X IPA symbol, which is the velar fricative. So in the place where you make a K sound or a G or an NG, it's a fricative in that location. Ah. So you get that little bit of friction in the back of the throat. Ah. Okay, and then finally there is that same R that appears in German, or I'm sorry, in French. There are two versions that you might see in IPA transcription. The upside down one is an approximant, so it's sort of like the difference between our American R and the rolled R version. There's also that kind of difference here. So the right side up one is a trill, where you actually get a couple of vibrations of the uvula in there, and then the approximant is where it just kind of comes close to that back of the throat. So if you were speaking in German, you would probably use this for the R in words like Bräutigam or Kreuz. But when we are singing in these languages, we typically substitute the rolled or flipped R because it's not pleasant to sing on that that uvular, your uvula is difficult to access when you're trying to make a good singing sound. Okay, so here's a little bit of example from the Brahms Requiem. You can see both versions of that ich and ach, the fricative sound are represented here in words like lieblich and sich, and in this case they're followed one after the other, sich nach. And so it can be difficult sometimes for people because they sound quite similar to us as people who don't use these sounds in our language of English, the ich and the ach, but they are actually acoustically quite different because of that placement in the mouth between the palate and the velum. So this whole text, wie lieblich sind deine Wohnungen, Herr Zebaoth, and there's that TS affricate. Meine Seele verlanget und sehnet sich nach den Vorhöfen des Herrn. And again, spoken, you would probably say Herr with the kind of uvular approximant, and here Herrn, probably roll that R when singing. Okay. Any questions about the French or the German?
Just some general questions for later, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So just to close, I've offered just a couple of additional resources. Some of these were shared after the first workshop if people did attend that, but they'll be shared again. So there's an online tool for typing IPA symbols. So I used this website to type all of the transcriptions that you see in this presentation. I've included a link to an interactive IPA chart where you can click on every sound on the chart, every symbol, and hear someone speak it, make the sound. And then for a really inside look, you can see physiological visualizations using MRI and ultrasound technology of someone's head as they are making all of those sounds. You can see how their tongue moves in their vocal tract. It's really fascinating. And they have also just like animated versions. So it can really help if you're having trouble with any of these sounds, can be really helpful to visualize if you're that kind of a visual and hopefully you can translate the visual to your own vocal anatomy. The final link that I've included is for a website called IPA Source. This is a subscription service you can pay to subscribe, and it has it's a database full of transcriptions of common art songs and arias. It's a great resource for singers. Particularly, it's geared more toward solo singing. But they also have free IPA guides for the most commonly sung languages. And so these are really helpful. They show you how letters of the alphabet appear in the language and how they're pronounced, as well as a general inventory of all the IPA symbols for that particular language. So it's super helpful, and they're all free to download. And other than that, that is pretty much it for me. So I'm happy to answer any further questions.
While you're on the topic of the IPA guides, I'm pulling up something. I have done some for other languages also. If anyone wants to, I'm happy to reach out to me. And they're from authoritative resources, but of course I'm fallible as a human. I have some in Czech and Finnish and Hebrew, Hungarian, Swedish. So if those languages are of interest, folks, I'm happy to share those. And I think they're actually on my website too. Okay, a few questions. One, a small one on the Diacritics page. Again, I think it was in the upper right. There's a comment about some things can be placed differently for a descender. I think I know what that is, but can you describe the descender in the upper right? In the description, the line of text. Sorry, I was on.
Yes. Good question. I don't know, Gary. What do you think?
I thought that had to do with when part of the symbol itself actually extends below the quote bottom line, like in the case of the ng that they have. There's that little tail. Scott, I just saw you wave your hand.
It's a typographic or orthographic feature of the icon of the symbol itself, of the glyph. Whenever part of the glyph descends below the baseline of the glyph, it's called a descender. Same thing with an ascender, and in terms of an ascender, the H would be, like the left-hand vertical bar of an H. In this particular case, across the top there, when we're looking at it's the little hook part that goes below the line. That's the descender.
Great.
Cool. A question on the German here coming up. regarding the sound of SH often being used in lieu of an ich-laut. Is that a regional thing or just a no-no?
No, I understand that is a regional thing, like, east, west, north, south, and Swiss as well, starts to get into, so pronouncing ish as ish. I think typically, unless you're doing an extremely regional, interpretation of something, or I think it's pretty much there's always standard, whatever language you're singing in, there's kind of standard pronunciation, just sort of like American Standard English or British Standard English. The same is true for these languages as well.
Now I want to hear two performances of the Brahms Requiem, one with Hamburg, Germany, because that's where he was born, and one for Viennese German, because that's what he would have heard.
Yeah.
I don't know. That may be over the top. One final question, I think, deals with the degree of tension in the mouth or ease of articulation, what effect that may have, and does that have an IPA representation, or is it simply a matter of tone color based on the singer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So again, not everything is able to be represented with these symbols, and I think that's part of why the diacritics can sometimes help in terms of that. But there are, for instance, as I was doing research and putting this together, I was reminded, there are certain differences. So for instance, the schwa in French, that is like at the end of a word, like this, the last word of this example, dire, the American schwa is quite open, and quite a bit lower than the French schwa, and yet the same symbol gets used. So mon cœur se, that sound is not sa recommandez-vous, right? It is quite a bit more closed, and yet you kind of just have to know that in French, that's the way that sound occurs. And so there have been attempts. You can get really deep, as I was going really deep. Some you can get down to squabbles over, well, is it actually a different symbol? Is it a different vowel? And it's not just, this is just one example of a kind of thing like that. So the quality of a T in one language is maybe different from, and we know this, like I was mentioning, aspiration and things like that. So it depends on how specific and narrow you want to get with your transcription, or if the IPA is there as a general guide, and then there are also some ground rules for just singing in that language, period, that you have to make a little bit of adjustment. A language I didn't include in this is Russian, but many of us, there's lots of choral music, vocal music, opera in Russian. And this gets into, do you use diacritics to represent the kind of heightening of a lot of the consonants that have that kind of palatal quality to them? So yes, there can be subtle variances and gradations, and I think it's helpful to listen, to speakers of the language and try to gather information that way, because certainly IPA can be very specific, but still, can't capture everything.
You mean it's still helpful to actually learn languages sometimes?
Yeah.
This has been fantastic, Michael. Thank you very much. I consider myself
pleasure.
Pretty reliable as a conductor on diction, and I have learned so much. So this is great. Thank you too for all of our participants for your questions and contributions. And once again, thank you to Scott, who's here in the other window, for devising this whole academy. This is fantastic. Today is our final installment in the 4th semester. Plans are already in the works for a 5th semester this fall, and all of us at the Emerald Ensemble are grateful for the enthusiasm of you, our audiences and supporters. As the Emerald Choral Academy continues, you can help to support these efforts by donating at emeraldensemble.org. And you can also let us know of topics that you would like to see discussed in the future. One already came up in the chat today, and I'm looking forward to implementing that somehow next semester. So in the meantime, I'm Gary Cannon. On behalf of Michael and Scott and all of the Emerald Ensemble, I wish you good physical, mental, and musical health. Thank you.